A broken Cherokee warrior with blood on his hands bought a family of 3 at a frontier auction and accidentally discovered the father's heart he thought he'd buried with his own children 10 years ago. What happened next in the unforgiving wilderness of 1867 would either destroy him completely or teach him that some bonds are stronger than blood, and some families are forged in fire rather than born. The dust never settled in Bitter Creek, Colorado territory. It hung in the air, like the ghosts of better days, coating everything with the color of dried blood and broken dreams. The sun beat down mercilessly on the ramshackle collection of buildings that dared call itself a town, baking the wooden sidewalks until they creaked like old bones under the weight of desperate men seeking their fortunes in a land that had already forgotten their names.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Elijah Ravencrow stood in the shadow of Murphy's General Store, watching the crowd gather around the auction block with the detached interest of a man who had seen too much to be surprised by anything. His weathered hands rested on the worn grip of his Colt revolver, fingers unconsciously tracing the intricate Cherokee symbols carved into the handle symbols that spoke of a heritage he'd tried to forget and a past that refused to stay buried. The buckskin jacket he wore was dark with sweat and older stains, and his long black hair hung loose around his shoulders, streaked with premature gray that spoke of nights spent staring into campfires and seeing faces that would never smile. Again, he'd been tracking a man named Cordell for 3 weeks through the Colorado Badlands, following a trail of broken promises and spilled blood that stretched from the Arkansas River to the shadow of the Rockies. The bounty on Cordell's head would feed Elijah for months, maybe even buy him passage to California, where a man could disappear into the gold fields and forget that the world had ever expected anything from him. But Cordell had vanished into the maze of mining camps and frontier settlements that dotted the territory like scabs on wounded earth, and Elijah found himself in Bitter Creek, with empty pockets and a growing hunger that had nothing to do with food. The auctioneer, a sweating man in a stained vest who went by the name of Hutchins, climbed onto the wooden platform that served as both auction block and gallows depending on the day of the week. His voice carried across the dusty street like the crack of a whip, cutting through the murmur of conversations and the constant whisper of wind through the buildings. "Gentlemen, ladies, and those of you still deciding," Hutchins called out, his voice thick with the false joviality of a man who made his living off other people's misery. "We've got a fine selection of items today. Farm equipment, livestock, and some very interesting human assets." Elijah felt his jaw tighten. He'd been in towns like this before, places where the line between civilization and savagery was so thin it might as well not exist. Places where a man's worth was measured in gold dust and gunpowder, and where the weak were devoured by the strong with the casual efficiency of wolves picking over a carcass. The first items up for bid were mundane: a plow that had seen better days, a team of oxen that looked ready for the knacker's yard, a collection of household goods that told the story of another family's dreams turned to dust. Elijah watched without interest as the townspeople bid against each other with the enthusiasm of carrion birds fighting over scraps. He'd seen it all before, the endless cycle of hope and disappointment that defined life on the frontier. It was when Hutchins called for the next lot that Elijah's attention sharpened like a blade drawn from its sheath. From behind the general store, a woman emerged with 3 children in tow, their faces pale with fear and exhaustion. The woman walked with her head held high despite the circumstances, but Elijah could see the tremor in her hands and the way her eyes darted around the crowd like a cornered animal looking for an escape that didn't exist. "Here we have the Dalton family," Hutchins announced, his voice taking on the practiced cadence of a man selling livestock. "Rose Dalton and her 3 children, aged 12, 9, and 6. Good Irish stock, all of them. The woman can cook, clean, and sew. The boy's old enough for heavy work, and the two younger ones won't eat much and can handle light duties. Rose Dalton stood on the platform with her children clustered around her like chicks seeking protection from a hawk. She was perhaps 30 years old, with auburn hair that caught the afternoon light and green eyes that held more fire than fear. Her dress was patched and worn, but clean, and she carried herself with a dignity that the circumstances couldn't quite break. The eldest child, Tommy, stood protectively in front of his younger siblings, his jaw set with a determination that reminded Elijah of another boy, in another time, who had tried to protect his family from forces beyond his control. The families being sold to satisfy debts owed to the Bitter Creek Land and Mining Company. Hutchins continued, consulting a piece of paper that fluttered in the wind. Late husband died in a mining accident 6 months ago. Left them with nothing but obligations. Company's been patient, but patients don't pay for feed and supplies. A murmur ran through the crowd, part sympathy and part calculation. Elijah recognized the look in the eyes of the men gathered around the platform, the same look he'd seen in the eyes of soldiers during the war, when they'd come across a farmhouse full of supplies and no one left to protect them. It was the look of predators sizing up prey, deciding how much trouble it would be to take what they wanted. "What's the opening bid?" called out a voice from the back of the crowd. Elijah turned to see a man in expensive suit and polished boots, the kind of man who got rich off other people's misery and slept well at night because he'd convinced himself it was just business. The man had the soft look of someone who'd never missed a meal or worked a day with his hands, and when he looked at Rose Dalton, it was with the same expression he might reserve for a horse he was considering buying. $50 for the lot. Hutchins replied, "That's just to cover the basic debt. Anyone willing to go higher gets a family that'll work hard and ask for little." 60, called out another voice. This one belonged to a rancher named Patterson, a man Elijah had seen around town. Patterson ran a spread about 20 miles north of Bitter Creek, and Elijah had heard stories about how he treated his hired hands. None of the stories were pleasant. 70, countered the man in the expensive suit. "They'll work in my hotel. The woman can clean rooms and cook. The boy can handle luggage and tend horses. The younger ones can help with whatever needs doing." Rose Dalton's face went pale, and she pulled her children closer. Even from his position in the shadows, Elijah could see the fear in her eyes as she began to understand what her life would become under either of these men. The boy, Tommy, stepped forward as if to say something, but his mother placed a restraining hand on his shoulder. 80, Patterson called out, his voice carrying the lazy confidence of a man who was used to getting what he wanted. "I can use them all on the ranch. Boys big enough to work cattle, and the woman looks strong enough for the heavy work around the house." The bidding continued, the price climbing slowly as more men joined in. Elijah watched from the shadows, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He'd seen this before, during the war and in its aftermath. He'd seen families torn apart by men who saw human beings as nothing more than assets to be bought and sold, and he'd sworn he'd never be part of it again. But as he watched Rose Dalton stand on that platform with her children, something stirred in his chest that he'd thought was dead and buried. It was a feeling he recognized but had tried to forget, a protective instinct that had once driven him to fight for his own family until there was nothing left to fight for. The woman's strength in the face of desperation reminded him of another woman, one who had faced her own trials with the same quiet dignity before the world had taken her away from him. The bidding reached $100, then $120. Patterson and the hotel owner were locked in a battle of wills, each determined to claim their prize. Other men shouted out bids, but it was clear that the real contest was between these two. Rose Dalton stood silent through it all, her face a mask of controlled terror as she watched her family's fate being decided by strangers who saw them as nothing more than commodities.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
150, Patterson called out, his voice carrying a note of finality. That's my final offer. Take it or leave it. The hotel owner hesitated, clearly calculating whether the family was worth more than he was willing to pay. The crowd grew quiet, sensing that the auction was nearing its end. Hutchins raised his gavel, preparing to bring it down and seal the Dalton family's fate. 200, Elijah said quietly. The words surprised him as much as they surprised the crowd. He hadn't planned to bid, hadn't even consciously decided to get involved. But something about the scene had triggered memories he'd tried to keep buried, and before he knew it, he was stepping out of the shadows and into the dusty street, where everyone could see him. The crowd turned to stare at him, and Elijah felt the familiar weight of their judgment. He knew what they saw, a half-breed bounty hunter with blood on his hands and death in his eyes. He'd grown used to the looks over the years, a mixture of fear and disgust that white folks reserved for men like him. But he'd stopped caring about their opinions long ago, and he wasn't about to start now. $200, he repeated, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. Cash. Patterson's face darkened. You got that kind of money, Breed? Elijah reached into his jacket and pulled out a leather pouch, heavy with gold coins. It was the last of his bounty money, the stake he'd been saving for his passage to California and a chance at a new life. He'd earned it tracking down a killer named Morrison through the Badlands of New Mexico, and every coin had been paid for with blood and sleepless nights. 250, Patterson snarled, his voice tight with anger. And I don't care if you got the money or not. These people deserve a Christian home, not whatever hell you're planning to drag them into. The crowd murmured agreement, and Elijah felt the familiar burn of anger in his chest. He'd heard it all before, the assumptions and prejudices that followed him wherever he went, but this time it was different. This time there were 3 lives hanging in the balance, and he found himself caring about their fate in a way that surprised him. 300, he said simply, his voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd like a knife. The silence that followed was deafening. $300 was more money than most of the men in the crowd saw in a year, and the fact that Elijah had it meant he was either very good at his job or very lucky. Either way, it was enough to give even Patterson pause. 325, the rancher called out, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. He was pushing the limits of what he could afford, and everyone knew it. 500. Elijah said, his voice calm and steady. The crowd gasped, and Patterson's face went white. $500 was a fortune in a place like Bitter Creek, more than enough to buy a small ranch or start a business. The fact that Elijah was willing to pay it for a widow and 3 children sent a ripple of shock through the assembled crowd. Going once, Hutchins called out, his voice shaking with excitement. Going twice ... He paused, looking around the crowd for any final bids. Sold to the Cherokee gentleman for $500. The gavel came down with a sound like a gunshot, and suddenly the auction was over. Rose Dalton and her children belonged to Elijah Ravencrow, a man they'd never seen before and knew nothing about. The crowd began to disperse, muttering among themselves about the strange turn of events they'd just witnessed. Elijah walked to the platform where Rose Dalton stood with her children, her face pale but determined. Up close, he could see the intelligence in her green eyes, the strength that had carried her through whatever trials had brought her to this moment. She was smaller than he'd expected, barely reaching his shoulder, but there was something about her that reminded him of a wildcat he'd once seen cornered by a pack of dogs, small, but dangerous if pushed too far. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat, "I'm Elijah Ravencrow." She studied his face for a long moment, and he wondered what she saw there. He knew he wasn't a handsome man, his face was too weathered, too marked by violence and hardship. But there was something in her expression that wasn't quite fear. which was more than he usually got from white folks. "Rose Dalton," she replied, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "These are my children, Tommy, Katie, and Ben." Elijah nodded to each of the children in turn. Tommy stared back with the suspicious defiance of a boy who'd been forced to grow up too fast. Katie watched him with open curiosity, her bright blue eyes taking in every detail of his appearance. Little Ben hid behind his mother's skirts, peeking out at the strange man who had just bought his family. "You got belongings?" Elijah asked. Rose gestured to a small pile of possessions near the platform, a battered trunk, a few bundles of clothing, and a wooden crate that looked like it might contain household goods. Everything they owned in the world, reduced to a handful of items that could be carried in a wagon. "That's all," she said simply. Elijah nodded and walked to where Hutchins waited with the bill of sale. The auctioneer's hands shook as he counted out the gold coins, and his eyes kept darting nervously to Elijah's face, as if he expected to be scalped at any moment. "Pleasure doing business with you, Mr. Ravencrow," Hutchins said, his voice high and nervous. "I hope you'll be satisfied with your purchase." Elijah took the bill of sale and folded it carefully, tucking it into his jacket. The piece of paper made it official. Rose Dalton and her 3 children were now his property, at least in the eyes of the law. The thought made him sick, but he pushed the feeling aside. He'd deal with the legalities later. Right now he had to get them out of Bitter Creek before someone decided to cause trouble. He walked back to where Rose waited with her children, his mind racing as he tried to figure out what to do next. He had a family now, something he'd never wanted and certainly never planned for. But as he looked at the 4 faces watching him with a mixture of fear and hope, he realized that backing out wasn't an option. He'd made his choice when he'd stepped out of the shadows and opened his mouth, and now he had to live with the consequences. "My horse is at the livery stable," he said. "I'll get a wagon and be back for you and your things. Wait here." Rose nodded, but her eyes never left his face. "Mr. Ravencrow," she said quietly, "what do you want from us?" It was a fair question, and one he didn't have a good answer for. He'd acted on instinct, driven by memories and emotions he'd thought were dead. But now that the moment had passed, he found himself wondering the same thing. What did he want from them? What was he going to do with a widow and 3 children in a territory where survival was a daily struggle? "I don't know," he said honestly. "But I know what those other men wanted, and it wasn't anything good." Rose's expression softened slightly, and for a moment he saw something that might have been gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you," she said simply. Elijah nodded and turned away, walking toward the livery stable with the weight of 4 lives on his shoulders. He'd spent the last 10 years running from responsibility, from the pain of caring about people who could be taken away without warning. But now he found himself walking straight back into the same trap. And the worst part was that he wasn't sure he wanted to escape. The livery stable was owned by an old German named Klaus who charged too much for everything and asked too many questions. But he kept his mouth shut about other people's business, which made him useful to men like Elijah, who preferred to keep their affairs private. "I need a wagon," Elijah said. "Something sturdy enough for a long trip." Klaus looked up from the harness. He was mending, his weathered face creasing into a frown. "You leaving town?" "Maybe. Good time for it. Word's getting around about what you did at the auction. Patterson's not happy about being outbid by a breed, and he's got friends who might want to do something about it." Elijah wasn't surprised. He'd expected trouble from the moment he'd opened his mouth to bid. Men like Patterson didn't like being shown up in public, especially by someone they considered beneath them. But he'd faced worse odds before, and he was still breathing. How long before they work up the courage to try something? He asked. Klaus shrugged. "Patterson's more bluster than action, but he's got a son who's not quite as smart as he thinks he is. I'd say you got maybe an hour before young Patterson and his friends decide to make a statement. An hour. It would have to be enough." Elijah paid for the wagon and a team of horses, then loaded Rose's belongings into the back. The trunk was heavier than it looked, and he wondered what she'd managed to save from her old life. The wooden crate rattled with the sound of dishes and cooking utensils, the humble tools of a woman who'd tried to make a home in an unforgiving land. By the time he drove the wagon back to the auction site, a small crowd had gathered around Rose and her children. Most of them were just curious, but Elijah could see the hostile faces mixed in with the merely nosy. News traveled fast in a small town, and everyone had heard about the Cherokee bounty hunter who'd spent $500 on a white family. "Time to go," he said as he pulled the wagon to a stop. Rose didn't argue. She helped her children into the back of the wagon, then climbed up onto the seat beside Elijah. Tommy sat in the back with his younger siblings, his hand resting on a quota bundle that Elijah suspected contained whatever weapons the family had managed to keep. "Where are we going?" Rose asked as Elijah snapped the reins and the wagon lurched into motion. "Away from here," he replied. "I got a cabin up in the mountains. It's not much, but it's safe." They rode in silence through the dusty streets of Bitter Creek, past the saloons and gambling halls where men drank away their sorrows and planned their next desperate schemes. Elijah kept one hand on the reins and the other near his gun, watching for signs of trouble. He could feel eyes on them from every doorway and window, and he knew that their departure was being noted by men who might decide to follow. As they reached the edge of town, Elijah heard the sound of hoofbeats behind them. He turned to see a group of riders approaching, led by a young man with Patterson's weak chin and angry eyes. There were 5 of them, all armed and riding hard. "Trouble," Elijah said quietly. Rose turned to look back at the approaching riders, her face pale but determined. "What do they want?" "To make a point," Elijah replied. He snapped the reins harder, urging the horses to move faster. The wagon was built for hauling freight, not for speed, and he knew they wouldn't be able to outrun mounted men. Young Patterson and his friends caught up with them, just as the wagon reached the first bend in the mountain road. They spread out to block the path, their horses dancing nervously as the riders drew their weapons. "That's far enough, Breed," young Patterson called out, his voice tight with the kind of nervous bravado that got men killed. "You're not taking that family anywhere." Elijah brought the wagon to a stop, his hand moving slowly to his gun. "They're mine, legally bought and paid for. You got a problem with that? Take it up with the law." "The law don't apply to your kind," another rider said. "These people deserve better than whatever you got planned for them." "What I got planned," Elijah said quietly, "is to get them somewhere safe. What you got planned is to get yourselves killed if you don't move out of my way." The tension stretched like a wire about to snap. Elijah could feel Rose's fear beside him, could hear the children's quiet breathing in the back of the wagon. He'd been in situations like this before, and he knew how they usually ended. But this time was different. This time he had people depending on him, people who would suffer if he made the wrong choice. "You're outnumbered 5-1, young Patterson said, his voice gaining confidence. "You really want to try your luck against those odds?" Elijah smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "Son, I've been outnumbered before. Sometimes the numbers don't matter as much as you think they do." His hand moved with the speed of a striking snake, the Colt clearing leather and firing before any of the riders could react. The shot took young Patterson in the shoulder, spinning him around in his saddle and sending him tumbling to the ground. The other riders reached for their weapons, but Elijah was already moving, rolling off the wagon seat and using the vehicle for cover. The gunfight was brief and brutal. When the smoke cleared, 3 of the riders were down and the other 2 were spurring their horses back toward town as fast as they could go. Elijah stood over young Patterson, who was clutching his wounded shoulder and whimpering like a child. "You tell your father," Elijah said quietly, "that the next time he wants to make a point, he should be prepared to pay the price for it." He climbed back onto the wagon, ignoring the shocked stares of Rose and her children. The smell of gunpowder hung in the air like incense, and he could see the fear in their eyes as they looked at him. He'd shown them what he was capable of, and now they knew exactly what kind of man had bought their freedom. "Are you all right?" Rose asked quietly. Elijah nodded, snapping the reins to get the horses moving again. "We need to get moving. Those two who got away will be back with reinforcements." They rode in silence for the next hour, climbing steadily into the mountains as the sun began to set behind the peaks. The road was rough and poorly maintained, winding through stands of pine and aspen that whispered secrets in the evening breeze. Elijah kept watch for signs of pursuit, but the trail behind them remained empty. Finally, as full darkness settled over the mountains, they reached a small clearing where a log cabin sat among the trees like a forgotten memory. Smoke rose from the chimney and yellow light spilled from the windows, creating a pool of warmth in the cold mountain air. "This is it," Elijah said, bringing the wagon to a stop. "Home." Rose looked at the cabin with tired eyes, taking in the rough-hewn logs and the small garden that grew beside the front porch. It wasn't much, but it was better than the streets of Bitter Creek, and it was theirs for as long as Elijah chose to. "Let them stay. It's beautiful," she said softly. Elijah helped her down from the wagon, then lifted the children out of the back. They stood in the clearing like lost souls, uncertain of what came next. He understood the feeling. He'd been asking himself the same question ever since he'd opened his mouth at the auction. "There's food inside," he said. "And beds. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow." As he carried their belongings into the cabin, Elijah caught sight of his reflection in the window. For just a moment, he saw not the broken man he'd become, but the father he'd once been. The sight filled him with a mixture of hope and terror that he wasn't sure he was ready to face. But as he watched Rose settle her children by the fire and begin to make them comfortable in their new home, he realized that, ready or not, his life had just taken a turn that would change everything. The Cherokee warrior who had walked into Bitter Creek that morning was gone, replaced by something he'd never expected to be again, a man with a family to protect. The cabin felt smaller with 5 people in it, but warmer too. Elijah hadn't realized how the silence had eaten away at him over the years, until he heard the soft murmur of voices filling the spaces between the log walls. Rose moved through the small rooms with the efficiency of a woman who had learned to make do with little, her hands already finding the rhythm of a new home. The children clustered together on the rough-hewn couch, their eyes wide as they took in their surroundings. The main room held a stone fireplace that dominated one wall, its hearth blackened by countless fires. A simple wooden table sat in the center, surrounded by chairs that Elijah had carved himself during the long winter months when the snow piled so deep against the windows that the world outside ceased to exist. The kitchen was nothing more than a few shelves and a cast-iron stove, but it was functional, and right now that was all that mattered. "There's a bedroom through that door," Elijah said, gesturing toward the back of the cabin. "You and the children can take it. I'll sleep out here." Rose looked at him with those green eyes that seemed to see more than they should. "Where do you usually sleep?" "In the bedroom," he admitted. "But that was before." "Before what?" "Before I had a family to think about." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither of them was ready to explore. Elijah turned away, busying himself with stoking the fire while Rose gathered her children and began the process of settling them into their new home. Tommy, the eldest, stood near the window looking out into the darkness. His shoulders were tense, and Elijah could see the boy's reflection in the glass, watchful and wary. At 12, Tommy was old enough to understand that their lives had changed in ways that couldn't be undone, old enough to know that safety was a luxury they couldn't afford to take for granted. "See anything out there?" Elijah asked, moving to stand beside the boy. Tommy shook his head. "Just darkness. But I keep thinking I hear things." What kind of things? Horses, men talking. Could be my imagination, but... Elijah placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, feeling the tension in the young muscles. Your imagination's kept you alive this long. Don't stop trusting it now. He moved to a cabinet beside the fireplace and pulled out a rifle, checking the action. With practiced ease. The weapon was well maintained, its stock worn smooth by years of use. He handed it to Tommy, who took it with the reverence of a boy who understood that survival sometimes depended on being ready to fight. You know how to use this? Tommy nodded. Pa taught me before he died. Said a man who couldn't protect his family wasn't much of a man at all. Your pa was right. But there's more to protecting people than just being willing to pull a trigger. Sometimes the best way to keep someone safe is to know when not to fight. From across the room, Rose watched the exchange with eyes that held a mixture of gratitude and concern. She'd lost one man to violence, and now she found herself dependent on another whose hands were stained with blood. But as she watched Elijah with her son, she saw something that surprised her patience, understanding, and a gentleness that seemed at odds with the deadly efficiency he displayed on the road. Katie, the middle child, had been exploring the cabin with the fearless curiosity of a 9-year-old. She'd discovered Elijah's small collection of books, most of them dealing with tracking, survival, and the natural world. Now she stood beside his chair, a worn volume of Cherokee legends in her hands. "Can you read this?" she asked, her voice bright with interest. Elijah looked at the book, recognizing the worn leather cover and the faded gold lettering. His grandmother had given it to him years ago, back when he'd still believed that the old ways meant something in a world that seemed determined to forget them. "Some of it," he said carefully. "The writing's in English, but the stories, they're from my people." "Your people?" "Cherokee, my mother's people." Katie opened the book to a random page, her finger tracing the words she couldn't yet read. "Will you tell me one of the stories?" Elijah felt something twist in his chest, a memory of another child asking for stories by firelight. His own daughter, Little Dove, had loved the old tales, especially the ones about Rabbit and his clever tricks. But Little Dove was gone now, buried in a grave he'd never been able to visit, and the stories had died with her. "Maybe later," he said, his voice rougher than he'd intended. Katie nodded, disappointed but not discouraged. She curled up in the chair beside him, the book still in her lap, and watched the fire dance in the hearth. Across the room, Ben, the youngest, had fallen asleep against his mother's shoulder, exhausted by the day's events and the emotional weight of leaving everything familiar behind. Rose looked at Elijah over her sleeping son's head. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for what you did today." "For all of it. Don't thank me yet," he replied. "You don't know what you've gotten yourself into." "I know what I've gotten myself out of. That's enough for now." The night passed quietly, but Elijah didn't sleep. He sat by the window with his rifle across his knees, watching the darkness for signs of pursuit. The men who'd run from the gunfight would be back, probably with reinforcements. Patterson wasn't the kind of man who accepted defeat gracefully, and his wounded pride would demand satisfaction. As dawn broke over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Elijah finally allowed himself to relax. If pursuit was coming, it would have arrived by now. The men of Bitter Creek were many things, but they weren't night fighters. They preferred their violence in broad daylight, where they could see what they were shooting at and count their advantages. Rose emerged from the bedroom, having settled her children for a few more hours of sleep. She moved quietly, trying not to disturb the peace of the morning, but Elijah heard her footsteps on the wooden floor. "Coffee?" she asked, already moving toward the kitchen. "I'd be grateful." She worked with the easy efficiency of a woman who'd been making coffee since she was old enough to reach the stove. The rich aroma filled the cabin, driving away the last shadows of the night and replacing them with something warm and familiar. When she handed him the cup, their fingers brushed, and Elijah felt a jolt of awareness that had nothing to do with the coffee. You didn't sleep, she observed. Couldn't. Too many years of sleeping light. The war? Elijah nodded, sipping the coffee and finding it strong enough to wake the dead. Among other things. Rose sat across from him at the table, her own cup cradled in her hands. What side did you fight on? It was a question that had caused him trouble before. The war had torn the Cherokee nation apart, just as it had torn apart the rest of the country, with families choosing different sides based on old grudges and new hopes. Elijah had fought for the Union, but that didn't make him popular with either side when the fighting was over. The winning side, he said carefully. Though sometimes I wonder if anybody really won. My husband fought for the Union too, Rose said. He said it was about more than just keeping the country together. He said it was about what kind of country we wanted to be, and what kind of country did we end up with. Rose looked around the cabin, taking in the rough walls and simple furnishings. One where a Cherokee bounty hunter can buy a family at auction and call it rescue. I'm not sure that's what Michael had in mind. Michael was your husband? Michael Dalton. He was a good man, maybe too good for the world we live in. He believed in doing the right thing, even when it cost him. She paused, staring into her coffee. Especially when it cost him. Elijah heard the pain in her voice, the grief that she carried like a stone in her chest. He recognized it because he carried the same weight, the same sense of loss that never quite healed no matter how much time passed. How did he die? He asked. Cave in at the mine. He was trying to shore up a tunnel that everybody else said was too dangerous to save. But there were men trapped inside, and Michael wouldn't leave them. Rose's voice was steady, but Elijah could see the tears she refused to shed. He got them out, all three of them. But the tunnel came down on him before he could follow. He sounds like a good man. He was. And I loved him for it. Even when I wanted to shake him for being so damn noble all the time. She looked up at Elijah, and he saw something in her eyes that made his chest tighten. You remind me of him, in some ways. I'm not a good man, Rose. Don't make that mistake. Maybe not. But you're a decent one, and sometimes that's enough. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of small feet on the wooden floor. Ben appeared in the doorway, his hair tousled from sleep and his eyes wide with the confusion of waking up in a strange place. He looked around the cabin, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings, and for a moment Elijah saw panic flicker across the child's face. Mama? Ben's voice was small and uncertain. I'm right here, sweetheart, Rose said, opening her arms. Ben ran to her, burying his face against her shoulder as she held him close. Everything's all right. We're safe now. But, even as she spoke the words, Elijah could see the doubt in her eyes. Safety was a relative thing in a world where men like Patterson had power and influence, where the law was whatever the strongest man said it was. He'd given them sanctuary, but he couldn't give them security. That was something they'd have to build for themselves, one day at a time. Tommy and Katie emerged from the bedroom a few minutes later, both looking more rested than they had the night before. Tommy immediately went to the window, checking the view with the automatic caution of someone who'd learned not to trust the quiet. Katie gravitated toward the bookshelf, her fingers trailing over the spines of the volumes Elijah had collected. Over the years, are you hungry? Rose asked, already moving toward the kitchen. I could make breakfast. There's not much, Elijah warned. I wasn't expecting company. I can work with whatever you have. I've gotten good at making something. From nothing. She rummaged through his supplies, finding flour, eggs, and a small piece of salt pork. Within minutes, the smell of cooking food filled the cabin, and Elijah felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The simple pleasure of sharing a meal with people he cared about. As they ate, the children began to relax their natural curiosity, overcoming their fear of the strange man who'd bought them. Katie asked questions about everything she saw, From the Cherokee symbols carved into the mantelpiece to the collection of arrowheads displayed on a shelf. Tommy was more reserved, but Elijah caught him studying the weapons and survival gear, with the interest of a boy who understood their importance. "What happens now?" Rose asked when they'd finished eating. It was the question Elijah had been dreading. He'd acted on impulse the day before, driven by memories and emotions he'd thought were dead. But now he had to face the practical realities of his decision. He had a family to support, children to protect, and nowhere near enough resources to do either properly. "I don't know," he admitted. "I wasn't planning on any of this. None of us were. But here we are." "Here we are," he agreed. "The way I see it, we have a few options. I could take you to Denver, help you get established there. It's a big city, lots of opportunities for someone willing to work hard." "And the other options?" Elijah looked around the cabin, seeing it through their eyes for the first time. It was rough, isolated, and far from any of the comforts of civilization. But it was also free from the judgments and prejudices that had made their lives in Bitter Creek impossible. "You could stay here," he said. "At least until we figure out something better." "What would we do?" "Whatever we had to. Hunt, trap, maybe do some trading with the settlements down the mountain. It's not an easy life, but it's honest work." Rose was quiet for a long moment, considering the alternatives. Denver offered opportunities, but also dangers. The city was full of men who would see a widow with 3 children as easy prey, and she'd already learned how quickly circumstances could change. The cabin offered isolation, but also protection from the world that had failed them. "What do you want?" she asked finally. Elijah looked at her, then at the children who were watching him with a mixture of hope and fear. What did he want? For 10 years he'd wanted nothing more than to forget, to lose himself in the endless cycle of tracking and killing that had become his life. But now, sitting in this cabin with these people, he found himself remembering what it felt like to belong somewhere. "I want you to be safe," he said. "I want your children to grow up without having to worry about men like Patterson. I want—" He paused, struggling with words that had been locked away for too long. "I want to be the kind of man your husband was, the kind who does the right thing, even when it costs him." Rose reached across the table and took his hand, her fingers warm against his scarred skin. "Then we'll stay," she said simply. "At least for now." The decision made, they spent the rest of the morning making plans. Elijah showed Tommy how to maintain the rifles and shotguns that would be their first line of defense against both human and animal predators. He taught Katie how to read the signs of approaching weather, knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death in the mountains. Even Ben, the youngest, was given tasks appropriate to his age-gathering kindling, organizing supplies, and learning the names of the plants and animals that shared their mountain home. Rose threw herself into the work of making the cabin truly livable. She rearranged furniture, cleaned spaces that had been neglected, and began the process of turning a bachelor's refuge into a family home. Elijah watched her work with a mixture of gratitude and amazement, seeing how she transformed the rough interior with nothing more than care and attention. By afternoon, the cabin had taken on a different character entirely. The table was set with mismatched plates and cups, creating a sense of ceremony around the simple act of sharing food. Rose had found fabric among their belongings and fashioned crude curtains for the windows, softening the harsh light and creating a sense of privacy. The children's few possessions were arranged on shelves and in corners, marking their territory and making the space their own. But it was the sound that made the biggest difference. For years, the cabin had been filled with nothing but the whisper of wind through the trees and the crack of settling wood. Now it hummed with life conversations, laughter, the rustle of pages turning as Katie worked her way through one of Elijah's books. It was a sound he'd thought he'd never hear again, and it filled him with a dangerous emotion he wasn't sure he was ready to name. As evening approached, Elijah found himself on the porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains. The sky was painted in brilliant shades of orange and purple, and the air carried the scent of pine and snow from the peaks above. It was beautiful, but he barely saw it. His mind was occupied with plans and possibilities, with the 1,000 details that would determine whether they could make a life in this isolated place. Rose joined him on the porch, moving quietly to stand beside him at the railing. She'd changed into a simple dress that had seen better days, but on her it looked elegant. Her hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her face was flushed with the satisfaction of a good day's work. "It's beautiful up here," she said, looking out over the valley below. "It is," he agreed. "But it's also dangerous. Winters are hard, and we're a long way from help if something goes wrong." "Something already went wrong," she pointed out. "Yesterday, we were facing a future that terrified me. Today, we have a chance to build something better. It won't be easy. Nothing worth having ever is." She turned to look at him, and he saw determination in her eyes that reminded him of another woman, in another time. Michael used to say that the only way to guarantee failure was to be afraid to try. "Your husband sounds like he was a wise man." "He was, and he'd like you, I think. He always said that a man's worth wasn't measured by what he'd done in the past, but by what he was willing to do for the people he cared about." Elijah felt something catch in his throat, an emotion he couldn't quite name. "I'm not sure I know how to care about people anymore," he said quietly. "It's been a long time." "Then it's a good thing you've got some teachers," Rose said with smile. "My children are experts at making people care about them, whether they want to or not." From inside the cabin came the sound of laughter as Tommy and Katie played some game they'd invented from scraps of wood and pieces of string. Ben's giggle rose above the others, pure and innocent in a way that made Elijah's chest ache with memories of his own daughter's laughter. "They're good children," he said. "They are. And they need a good man to show them how to be good adults." Rose paused, studying his profile in the fading light. "You bought us yesterday, Elijah. But I think we might be buying you back." "From what?" "From whatever darkness you've been living in." Michael always said that the best way to heal from pain was to help someone else heal from theirs. Elijah didn't respond, but he felt the truth of her words settling into his bones like warmth from a fire. He'd been running from his pain for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to stand still, to let himself feel something other than the empty ache of loss. But now, standing on this porch with this woman and her children safe inside his home, he felt something else stirring in his chest. Hope. As full darkness settled over the mountains, they went inside and gathered around the fireplace. Rose had found needle and thread among their supplies, and she worked on mending a tear in Ben's shirt, while the children played quietly on the floor. Elijah sat in his chair, cleaning his rifle with the automatic precision of a man who'd learned that survival depended on attention to detail. "Tell us about the Cherokee," Katie said suddenly, looking up from the book she was reading. "Tell us about your people." Elijah's hand stilled on the rifle. It was a request he'd been expecting, but he still wasn't sure how to answer. The Cherokee nation had been shattered by the war, its people scattered and its traditions threatened by the relentless advance of white civilization. What was left of his heritage felt too precious to share, too fragile to expose to the questions of children who wouldn't understand the weight of what they were asking. "What do you want to know?" he asked carefully. "Everything," Katie said with the boundless curiosity of youth. "What were they like? How did they live? Are there still Cherokee people somewhere?" Tommy looked up from his game, interested despite himself. Even Ben seemed to be listening, his small hand still as he played with a carved wooden horse. "Yes," Elijah said finally. "There are still Cherokee people. Not as many as there once were, but we're still here." "We?" Rose asked gently. "I'm Cherokee, but I'm also white. My father was a soldier, stationed at the fort near my mother's village. He fell in love with her, and she with him. It was complicated. What was she like? Katie asked. Your mother? Elijah felt his throat tighten. He hadn't spoken of his mother in years, hadn't allowed himself to remember the woman who'd given him life and love and a connection to something greater than himself. She was beautiful, he said quietly, and strong. She taught me the old stories, the ones about how the world was made and why things are the way they are. She taught me to read the signs in nature, to understand the language of animals and plants. And your father? He was a good man, but he was also a white man in a world that didn't have room for Cherokee wives and half-breed children. When the army transferred him, he took us with him. We lived on the edges of white society, never quite belonging but never quite outcasts either. What happened to them? The question hung in the air like smoke, heavy with implications. Elijah looked at Katie's earnest face, at Tommy's growing maturity, at Ben's innocent curiosity. They deserved the truth, or at least as much of it as he could bear to tell. They died, he said simply. Fever, during the war. I was away, fighting with the Union forces. When I came home, they were already buried. The silence that followed was broken only by the crackle of the fire and the whisper of wind through the trees. Rose reached over and placed a hand on his arm, a gesture of comfort that spoke more than words could convey. I'm sorry, Katie said softly. I shouldn't have asked. No, it's all right. They were good people, and they deserve to be remembered. Elijah looked at each of the children in turn, seeing in their faces the hope and trust that he'd thought he'd lost forever. Maybe it's time I started remembering the good things along with the bad. As the evening wore on, the conversation turned to lighter topics. Rose shared stories of her life in Ireland, of the green hills and stone cottages that had shaped her childhood. The children talked about their father, about the man who'd loved them enough to die for strangers. And slowly, carefully, Elijah began to share pieces of his own past, not the dark years of war and loss, but the earlier times when the world had been full of possibility and wonder. When it came time for bed, the children settled into their makeshift arrangements with the adaptability of youth. Tommy took a bedroll near the window, positioning himself where he could watch for trouble. Katie curled up on the couch with one of Elijah's books, reading by firelight until her eyes grew heavy. Ben slept in the bedroom with his mother, still young enough to need the comfort of her presence. Elijah sat by the fire long after the others had gone to sleep, staring into the flames and thinking about the strange turns his life had taken. 24 hours ago, he'd been a solitary hunter with nothing to his name but a horse, a rifle, and a reputation for violence. Now he was responsible for 4 lives, bound to them by choice rather than blood, but no less committed for the difference. Fire burned low, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. In the bedroom, he could hear Rose's quiet breathing, the soft sounds of a woman who'd found a moment of peace in a world that offered precious little of it. From the couch came Katie's gentle snores, and from the floor near the window, Tommy's alert stillness that spoke of a boy learning to be a man too quickly. Elijah added another log to the fire, watching the flames leap higher as they consumed the dry wood. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions to make and responsibilities to shoulder. But tonight, for the first time in 10 years, he wasn't alone. Tonight, he had a family again, fragile and unexpected, but real nonetheless. As he finally prepared for sleep, spreading his bedroll on the floor near the fire, Elijah found himself thinking about the Cherokee belief that everything happened for a reason, that the Great Spirit guided the paths of all living things toward their proper destiny. He'd stopped believing in destiny years ago, had convinced himself that life was nothing more than a series of random events strung together by chance and choice. But now, lying in the darkness with the quiet sounds of his new family around him, he began to wonder if maybe his grandmother had been right after all. Maybe some things were meant to be, and maybe sometimes the heart knew what it needed, even when the mind couldn't understand. The fire settled into glowing coals, and Elijah closed his eyes, allowing himself to hope that tomorrow would bring them all one step closer to the life they were trying to build together. It was a dangerous emotion, hope, one that had betrayed him before. But as he drifted towards sleep, he found himself willing to risk it one more time. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, carrying with it the scent of snow and the promise of winter. But inside the cabin, warmth prevailed, and for the first time in years, Elijah Ravencrow slept without dreams of the dead. 3 weeks had passed since they'd arrived at the mountain cabin, and the rhythm of their days had begun to feel natural. The children had adapted with the resilience of youth, finding wonder in the wilderness that surrounded them. Tommy had become Elijah's shadow, learning to track deer through the forest and read the signs that told stories of the creatures that shared their mountain home. Katie had discovered a love for the medicinal plants that grew wild in the meadows, her quick mind absorbing everything Elijah taught her about Cherokee healing traditions. Even little Ben had found his place, his laughter echoing through the trees as he played elaborate games with sticks and stones. But it was the changes in Elijah himself that were most remarkable. The hard edges that had defined him for so long were beginning to soften, worn smooth by the daily interactions with people who saw him not as a dangerous half-breed bounty hunter, but simply as the man who kept them safe and warm. Rose watched him with growing amazement as he patiently answered Katie's endless questions, or helped Ben carve a whistle from a piece of birch bark. This was not the same man who had stood in the dust of Bitter Creek, radiating barely contained violence. The morning that would change everything started like any other. Elijah was teaching Tommy how to set snares for rabbits, while Rose worked in the small garden patch behind the cabin, coaxing vegetables from the mountain soil. Katie was gathering wild herbs under Rose's watchful eye, her small hands gentle with the delicate plants. Ben played nearby, his wooden animals arranged in elaborate processions across the cleared ground. It was Ben who first noticed the smoke. "Mama," he called out, his voice carrying a note of concern. "There's smoke coming from the valley." Rose straightened, shading her eyes with her hand as she looked toward the distant settlement of Pine Ridge. A thin column of black smoke rose from the collection of buildings that nestled in the valley below, too thick and dark to be from a simple cooking fire. "Elijah," she called, her voice sharp with worry. He emerged from the forest with Tommy close behind, both of them carrying the rabbits they'd caught in the snares. His eyes immediately found the smoke, and his expression hardened with the instinctive wariness of a man who'd learned to read danger in the smallest signs. "Could be anything," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "House fire maybe, or someone burning brush." "That's not brush smoke," Tommy said quietly. "Pa taught me to read. Smoke, that's buildings burning." Rose felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Pine Ridge was where they'd been planning to trade for winter supplies, the closest thing to civilization in these mountains. If something had happened to the settlement, they would be truly isolated, cut off from any hope of help or supplies. "We need to know what's happening," she said. Elijah shook his head. "We need to stay here. Whatever's going on down there, it's not our problem." "What if it becomes our problem?" Rose asked. "What if whatever happened there is heading this way?" The question hung in the air like the smoke itself, dark and ominous. Elijah studied the distant column, his mind racing through possibilities. Pine Ridge was a small settlement, mostly miners and their families trying to scratch a living from the unforgiving mountain terrain. They'd always been friendly enough to him, treating him with the careful respect that frontier people reserved for dangerous but useful men. But he'd also heard rumors of trouble brewing in the territory, whispers of cattle rustlers and claim jumpers who preyed on isolated communities. "I'll go take a look," he said finally. "Tommy, you stay here with your mother and sisters. Keep the rifle close." "I'm coming with you," Tommy said, his young face set with determination. "No, you're not. Your job is to protect your family. What if something happens to you?" Rose asked, voicing the fear that had been growing in her chest. "What if you don't come back?" Elijah looked at her, seeing the worry in her green eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly as she held Ben close. In the past 3 weeks, she'd begun to depend on him in ways that went beyond simple gratitude. He'd become the foundation of their small family, the protector who stood between them and a world that had already proven its willingness to destroy everything they cared about. "I'll come back," he said simply. "I promise." But as he saddled his horse and checked his weapons, Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that the peaceful interlude they'd enjoyed was about to come to an end. The smoke in the valley was more than just a fire. It was a warning, a sign that the violence and chaos they'd fled from Bitter Creek had found them even here in their mountain sanctuary. The ride down to Pine Ridge took him through terrain he knew well, a winding trail that switchbacked through stands of aspen and pine. The smoke grew thicker as he descended, and by the time he reached the outskirts of the settlement, he could smell the acrid scent of burning wood and something else, something that made his stomach clench with recognition. Pine Ridge was dying. Half the buildings were already reduced to smoldering ruins, their wooden walls and roofs consumed by flames that had burned hot and fast. The general store, the saloon, the small church where the miners' wives gathered on Sundays, all of them were gone, leaving only blackened timbers and drifting ash. But it was the silence that told him the whole story. There were no voices calling for help, no sounds of people fighting the fires or trying to save what remained. The only sound was the whisper of wind through the ruins and the occasional crack of settling wood. Elijah dismounted and walked through the destruction, his hand never leaving his gun. Bodies lay scattered in the dust, some cut down by bullets, others showing the brutal efficiency of knife work. Men, women, even children, the raiders had shown no mercy, no discrimination in their killing. He found the answer to his questions in the ruins of the general store. Painted on the one wall that still stood were words that made his blood run cold. "Cherokee scum, you're next." The message was clear, and it was meant for him. Someone had tracked him to Pine Ridge, had learned about his connection to the settlement. The massacre wasn't random violence, it was a message, a warning of what was coming for him and the family he'd tried to protect. As he stood among the ruins, memories flooded back with the force of a physical blow. Another settlement, another time. The smell of smoke and blood, the sound of his daughter's screams cut short by gunfire. He'd been away then too, tracking a wanted man through the Badlands while his family died in flames. The guilt had eaten at him for 10 years, the knowledge that he'd failed in the most basic duty of any man to protect the people he loved. But this time was different. This time he had warning, and he had the chance to fight back. The men who'd done this were probably already on their way to his cabin, confident that they'd delivered their message and that he would be paralyzed by fear. They didn't know that. Fear had burned out of him years ago, replaced by something colder and more dangerous. Elijah remounted his horse and began the long ride back up the mountain, his mind already working through plans and possibilities. The cabin was defensible, built into the side of the mountain with clear fields of fire in all directions. But it would also be a trap if they were surrounded, and he couldn't risk the lives of Rose and her children in a siege. The sun was setting. By the time he reached the cabin, painting the sky in shades of red that reminded him too much of the flames that had consumed Pine Ridge, Rose was waiting for him on the porch, her face pale with worry, and he could see the relief in her eyes when she spotted him coming up the trail. "What happened?" she asked as he dismounted. "Pine Ridge is gone," he said simply. "Everyone's dead." The words hit her like a physical blow. "Dead? All of them? All of them. And they left a message for me." He told her about the painted words, about the systematic nature of the killing. As he spoke, he watched her face go through a range of emotions, shock, fear, and then something harder, more determined. "How long do we have?" she asked. Not long. They'll come tonight, probably. They want to finish what they started. Rose was quiet for a moment, absorbing the implications. Then she straightened, and Elijah saw something in her expression that reminded him of a wolf protecting its cubs. "What do? We run," he said. "Pack what we can carry and get as far away from here as possible. And then what? Keep running for the rest of our lives?" Elijah looked at her, seeing the strength that had carried her through the loss of her husband and the auction block in Bitter Creek. "If that's what it takes." "No," she said firmly. "I'm tired of running. We all are." From inside the cabin came the sound of children's voices as Tommy helped his younger siblings prepare for bed. Normal sounds of a normal family in a normal world. But their world was far from normal, and the normalcy they'd built was about to be shattered. "Rose," Elijah said quietly, "you don't understand what we're up against. These aren't just claim jumpers or cattle rustlers. They're killers, and they've got a specific grudge against me." "Then tell me about it," she said. "Tell me why they want you dead." For a long moment, Elijah was silent. The full truth was something he'd never told anyone, a secret that had burned in his chest for 10 years. But looking at Rose's face, seeing the trust and determination in her eyes, he knew that she deserved to know what she was risking her children's lives for. "During the war," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "I was a scout for the Union Army. My job was to find Confederate camps and report back on their positions. But sometimes I did more than just report." Rose waited, understanding that he was struggling with words that had been locked away for too long. "There was a Confederate officer named Colonel Hayes," Elijah continued. "He was recruiting Cherokee warriors to fight for the South, using a combination of bribes and threats. My own cousin was one of the men he convinced to join. What happened? Hayes was holding a meeting in a farmhouse outside of Tulsa. 20 Cherokee men, all of them armed and dangerous. I was supposed to just observe, but when I saw my cousin there..." Elijah's voice broke slightly. "I couldn't let him throw his life away for the Confederate cause. So you attacked?" "I burned the farmhouse down around them, all of them. My cousin, Hayes, everyone." The words came out in a rush, as if he couldn't bear to hold them in any longer. "I told myself it was about the war, about stopping Hayes from recruiting more men. But the truth was, I was angry. Angry at my cousin for choosing the wrong side. Angry at the world for tearing our people apart." Rose reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "You were trying to save him." "I was trying to save him by killing him," Elijah said bitterly. "And Hayes had a son. A boy named Nathan who was about Tommy's age. He wasn't at the meeting, but he saw the smoke. He saw his father die, and now he's grown up. And he spent the last 10 years tracking down everyone who was involved in that raid. I'm the last one left." The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, and Rose could see the shape of the trap that was closing around them. Nathan Hayes had found Elijah's trail, had followed it to Pine Ridge, and then to the cabin. The massacre of the settlement hadn't been random. It had been a deliberate act of psychological warfare, designed to isolate Elijah and force him to face his past. "How many men does he have?" she asked. "I don't know. Enough to take a settlement. Like Pine Ridge, maybe a dozen, maybe more." "And you think he's coming here tonight?" Elijah nodded. "He wants to finish what his father started. And he wants me to know it's coming." Rose looked toward the cabin, where her children were safe and warm, blissfully unaware of the danger that was approaching. She thought of Michael, of the choice he'd made to save those trapped miners, even though it cost him his life. She thought of the man standing beside her, who'd risked everything to save her family from a fate worse than death. "We don't run," she said firmly. "We fight." "Rose, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly," she interrupted. "You made a choice 10 years ago, and now you're paying the price for it. But my children aren't going to pay that price. They're not going to spend their lives running from your ghosts. Elijah stared at her, seeing the steel in her green eyes, the determination that had carried her through every trial life had thrown at her. In that moment, he realized that he'd been wrong about her. She wasn't just a woman who needed protecting. She was a warrior in her own right. Someone who would fight for her family with the same fierce devotion that had once driven him to burn down a farmhouse full of enemy soldiers. "All right," he said quietly. "We fight, but we do it smart, and we do it together." As they stood on the porch, watching the last light fade from the sky, both of them knew that the quiet life they'd built in the mountains was about to end. But they also knew that they would face whatever came next as a family, bound together by choice and strengthened by love. The war for their survival was about to begin. And this time, Elijah Ravencrow would not fight alone. The transformation of their mountain sanctuary into a fortress happened with grim efficiency. As darkness settled over the peaks, Elijah moved through the cabin with the methodical precision of a man who'd prepared for war before. Every window became a firing position, every piece of furniture a potential barricade. The children watched, in fascination and growing fear as their peaceful home became something harder, more dangerous. Tommy proved invaluable, his young hands steady as he helped load ammunition and position weapons. At 12, he was old enough to understand that this wasn't a game, that the men coming for them would show no mercy to women and children. Rose had given him one of Elijah's spare pistols, and the boy wore it with the serious dignity of someone who knew he might have to use it. "Remember what I taught you," Elijah said quietly as they worked. "Don't shoot unless you have a clear target. Make every bullet count." Katie had been assigned the task of keeping Ben calm and quiet, but her bright eyes missed nothing as she watched the preparations. She'd positioned herself near the back window, where she could see the trail that led down the mountain. Her job was to watch for the first signs of approaching riders, to give them precious seconds of warning that might mean the difference between life and death. "How many bullets do we have?" Rose asked, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "Enough," Elijah replied, though they both knew it wasn't true. He had perhaps 50 rounds for his rifle, another 30 for his pistol. Tommy's gun held 6 shots, and there were 2 more cylinders loaded and ready. Against a dozen men or more, it would have to be enough. The waiting was the hardest part. They sat in the darkened cabin, listening to the night sounds of the mountain, and trying to distinguish between the natural creaking of the building and the sounds that might herald approaching danger. Ben had fallen asleep in his mother's arms, exhausted by the tension he didn't fully understand. Katie maintained her vigil at the window, her small form silhouetted against the starlit sky. It was nearly midnight when she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Someone's coming." Elijah moved to the window, his eyes scanning the darkness below. At first he saw nothing, but then he caught a glimpse of movement among the trees, shadows that moved with purpose, too deliberate to be animals. He counted at least 8 figures, but there were probably more hidden in the darkness. "There, surrounding us," he said quietly. "Everyone get to your positions." The family moved with practiced efficiency, each person taking their assigned place. Rose positioned herself at the front window, her rifle ready. Tommy covered the side windows, his young face set with determination. Katie stayed with Ben at the back of the cabin, ready to shepherd him to safety if the worst happened. The silence stretched like a held breath. Then, from somewhere in the darkness, a voice called out, "Elijah Ravencrow, I know you're in there." The voice was young but hard, carrying the weight of years spent nursing a grudge. Elijah recognized the tone, if not the voice itself, the barely controlled fury of a man who'd spent his life preparing for this moment. "Nathan Hayes," Elijah called back. "You're a long way from home." "Home burned down 10 years ago," came the reply. "Along with my father and 20 good men. You remember them, don't you?" Elijah closed his eyes, seeing again the flames that had consumed the farmhouse outside Tulsa. He remembered the screams, the smell of burning flesh, the satisfaction he'd felt at stopping Hayes' recruitment efforts. But he also remembered the guilt that had eaten at him ever since, the knowledge that he'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "I remember," he said simply. "Good, then you know why I'm here. To finish what your father started?" "To finish what you started," Nathan corrected. "You killed my father, Ravencrow. Burned him alive along with men who were only trying to defend their homeland. And now it's your turn." Rose looked at Elijah, seeing the pain in his eyes, the weight of old guilt that had driven him to this moment. She understood now why he'd been so reluctant to let anyone get close, why he'd spent 10 years running from his past. But she also saw something else in his expression, a resolve that hadn't been there before, a determination to protect what he'd found worth protecting. "What do you want?" Elijah called out. "I want you to come out here and face me like a man. No hiding behind women and children, just you and me. And if I do, you'll let them go?" The pause that followed was answer enough. Nathan Hayes hadn't come all this way to leave witnesses. He'd come to finish the job, to wipe out everyone connected to the man who destroyed his family. "I thought so," Elijah said. "Then I guess we do this the hard way." The attack came without warning. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness as Hayes' men opened fire from multiple positions, their bullets splintering the cabin walls and shattering windows. Elijah returned fire immediately, his shots carefully aimed at the telltale flashes of enemy guns. Rose joined him, her rifle barking as she laid down covering fire. The sound was deafening in the confined space of the cabin. Ben woke screaming, and Katie held him close, whispering reassurances that neither of them believed. Tommy crawled to his assigned window, his pistol ready, waiting for a target to present itself. "They're trying to burn us out," Rose shouted over the gunfire. Elijah could smell smoke, could see the orange glow of flames beginning to lick at the cabin walls. Hayes was using the same tactic that had been used against his father fire as a weapon, forcing them to choose between burning alive or running into the guns of their enemies. "Tommy," Elijah called, "the water barrels." The boy understood immediately. He crawled to the corner where they kept their water supply, dragging the heavy containers toward the spreading flames. Rose abandoned her position to help him, the two of them working desperately to douse the fire before it could take hold. But the flames were spreading faster than they could fight them. The dry wood of the cabin walls caught easily, and soon the small structure was filled with smoke that burned their eyes and made breathing difficult. They were running out of time. "We have to get out," Rose said, her voice tight with fear. "That's what they want," Elijah replied. "They'll cut us down the moment we step outside." "Then what do we do?" Elijah looked around the cabin that had become their home, seeing the flames eating away at the walls like hungry animals. In a few minutes, the structure would be fully engulfed, and they'd have no choice but to run. But running meant certain death, and he'd sworn he wouldn't let that happen. Again. "The root cellar," he said suddenly, "under the floorboards. It opens into the old mine shaft." Rose stared at him. "Mine shaft?" "The cabin was built on an old claim. The tunnel goes about 50 yards into the mountain before it connects to a natural cave system. If we can get to it, we might be able to get out behind them." It was a desperate plan, but it was their only chance. They worked quickly, pulling up the floorboards to reveal a narrow opening that led down into darkness. The smell of earth and stale air rose from the depths, along with something else, the faint sound of running water. "Katie first," Elijah said. Then Ben. The children disappeared into the darkness, their small forms swallowed by the tunnel. Rose followed, her rifle clutched in her hands. Tommy hesitated, looking back at the cabin that had been their sanctuary. "Go," Elijah said. "I'll be right behind you." But as Tommy lowered himself into the tunnel, Elijah took one last look around the burning cabin. On the mantelpiece, barely visible through the smoke, was the photograph of his first family, his wife and daughter, smiling at a camera in a world that no longer existed. He grabbed it, shoving it into his jacket before following the others. Into the darkness, the tunnel was narrow and low, forcing them to crawl on their hands and knees through the suffocating darkness. The sound of their breathing echoed off the walls, and Elijah could hear Ben's quiet sobbing as Katie tried to comfort him. Behind them, the sound of gunfire continued as Hayes' men maintained their assault on the burning cabin. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, but finally they emerged into a larger space, a natural cave carved by centuries of flowing water. A small stream ran along one wall, its sound echoing in the darkness. Elijah lit a match, revealing rough stone walls and multiple passages leading deeper into the mountain. Which way? Rose asked. Elijah studied the cave system, trying to remember the stories the old miners had told about the tunnels that honeycombed the mountain. There was supposed to be an entrance on the far side of the ridge, hidden among the rocks and trees. If they could find it, they might be able to circle around behind Hayes' men. This way, he said, choosing a passage that seemed to slope upward. They moved through the darkness like ghosts, following the sound of running water and the faint movement of air that suggested an opening somewhere ahead. The children were exhausted and frightened, but they pressed on without complaint, understanding that their lives depended on reaching safety. It was Katie who first saw the light, a faint glow that filtered down through a crack in the ceiling. They climbed toward it, emerging onto a rocky ledge that overlooked their burning cabin. The structure was fully engulfed now, its walls collapsing in showers of sparks and flame. Hayes' men had gathered in a rough circle around the cabin, their faces lit by the fire as they watched their work. There were 12 of them, all armed with rifles and pistols. At their center stood a young man who could only be Nathan Hayes tall, lean with his father's aristocratic features and eyes that burned with fanatic intensity. "Burn in hell, Ravencrow," Hayes said, his voice carrying clearly in the mountain air, "just like my father did." From their position on the ledge, Elijah could see the tactical situation clearly. Hayes' men were spread out, but they were all focused on the burning cabin. They weren't expecting an attack from above, and the rocky terrain would provide good cover for a fighting withdrawal. "Stay here," he told the others. "I'm going to end this." "No," Rose said firmly. "We do this together." "Rose, this isn't your fight." "Yes, it is. You're family now, and family fights together." Elijah looked at her, seeing the determination in her eyes, the fierce protectiveness that had made her willing to risk everything for her children. He thought of his first family, of the woman who died while he was away chasing bounties. This time would be different. This time he wouldn't face his demons alone. "All right," he said quietly, "but we do this smart. Tommy, you take the high ground with the rifle. Rose, you come with me. Katie, you stay here with Ben and keep him quiet." They moved like shadows down the rocky slope, using the darkness and the sound of the burning cabin to mask their approach. The smell of smoke filled the air, and Elijah could feel the heat of the flames on his face as they drew closer to Hayes' position. The first shot came from Tommy's rifle, taking down one of the sentries before the man could raise an alarm. Elijah and Rose opened fire simultaneously, their bullets finding targets among the confused and scattered men. The surprise was complete. Hayes' men had been expecting to flush out their prey like animals, not to be hunted themselves, but Nathan Hayes was his father's son, and he recovered quickly from the shock of the ambush. He rallied his remaining men, organizing them into a defensive position behind the rocks and trees that surrounded the burning cabin. The advantage of surprise was gone, and now it was a straight fight between desperate people with everything to lose. "You can't win, Ravencrow," Hayes called out, his voice tight with fury. "I've got more men than you have bullets." "Maybe," Elijah replied, his rifle speaking for him as he put another round into the rocks where Hayes was hiding. But you've got more to lose than I do." The gunfight raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Smoke from the burning cabin provided cover for both sides, and the rocky terrain made it difficult to get clear shots. Tommy's rifle cracked from the high ground, keeping Hayes' men pinned down while Elijah and Rose worked their way closer to the enemy position. It was Rose who spotted the opportunity. One of Hayes' men had moved too far from cover, trying to get a better angle on Tommy's position. She put a bullet in his chest, and as he fell, she saw Nathan Hayes himself, exposed for just a moment as he tried to help his wounded man. "Elijah," she called. He turned, saw the target, and took the shot. The bullet caught Hayes in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him tumbling behind the rocks. But the wound wasn't fatal, and Elijah knew that as long as Hayes lived, the threat would never end. "Cover me," he said, and before Rose could protest, he was moving toward the enemy position. The final confrontation happened in the space between two boulders, lit by the dying flames of the cabin. Nathan Hayes struggled to his feet, his left arm hanging useless at his side, a pistol in his right hand. He was young, maybe 25, with the same aristocratic features that had marked his father. "You should have stayed dead," Hayes said, raising his pistol. "Probably," Elijah agreed. "But I've got something to live for now." They fired simultaneously. Hayes' bullet went wide, thrown off by his wounded shoulder. Elijah's shot was true, taking the young man in the chest and dropping him to his knees. Hayes looked down at the spreading stain on his shirt, then up at Elijah with eyes that held more surprise than anger. "Tell me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "was it worth it? All those men you killed?" Elijah looked at the dying man, seeing in his face the boy who'd watched his father burn, who'd spent 10 years nurturing his hatred and planning his revenge. He thought of his own daughter, of the family he'd lost and the family he'd found. "No," he said quietly, "it wasn't worth it. But this is." Nathan Hayes smiled, a bitter expression that transformed his face into something almost human. Then he fell forward, and the war that had begun 10 years ago in a burning farmhouse finally came to an end. The silence that followed was broken only by the crackling of the dying fire and the distant sound of the wind through the trees. Elijah stood over Hayes' body, feeling the weight of the years lifting from his shoulders. The guilt would never entirely go away, but for the first time in a decade, he felt something like peace. Rose appeared at his side, her face streaked with soot and tears. "Is it over?" "It's over," he said, pulling her into his arms. "We can go home now." But as they looked at the smoldering ruins of their cabin, they realized that home wasn't a place. It was the people who stood with you when the world tried to tear you apart. And in that moment, surrounded by the family he'd never expected to have, Elijah Ravencrow understood what his grandmother had meant when she said that some things were worth fighting for. Dawn broke over the ashes of their old life, painting the sky in soft pastels that seemed obscene after the violence of the night. The cabin was nothing more than a blackened skeleton, its walls collapsed and its roof open to the morning sky. Smoke still rose from the ruins, carrying with it the dreams and hopes they'd built in those humble rooms. Elijah stood at the edge of the clearing, his arm around Rose as they surveyed the destruction. The children clustered close, their faces streaked with soot and exhaustion. They'd survived the night, but at a cost that went beyond the loss of their physical home. The sanctuary they'd built in the mountains was gone, and with it, the illusion that they could simply disappear from the world and its troubles. "What happens now?" Tommy asked, his voice small in the morning stillness. It was a question that had been weighing on all their minds. The cabin had been more than just shelter. It had been their refuge, their place of safety in a world that seemed determined to destroy everything they cared about. Now they were homeless again, reduced to the clothes on their backs and the weapons in their hands. "We rebuild," Elijah said simply. "Somewhere else." Rose turned to look at him, seeing something in his expression that hadn't been there before. The haunted look was gone, replaced by something cleaner, more purposeful. The ghosts that had driven him for 10 years had finally been laid to rest, and for the first time since she'd known him, he seemed truly at peace. "Where?" she asked. "I know a place. A valley about 30 miles north of here. Good water, fertile soil, and far enough from the settlements to give us privacy. My grandfather used to take me there when I was a boy. He said it was sacred ground, protected by the spirits." Katie looked up from where she was gathering their few remaining possessions. "Will we be safe there?" "Safer than anywhere else," Elijah replied. The old Cherokee believed that some places were set aside for healing, for starting over. Maybe it's time we found out if they were right. The journey to the valley took them through some of the most beautiful country any of them had ever seen. They traveled on foot, leading Elijah's horse loaded with their supplies, following ancient trails that wound through stands of aspen and pine. The higher they climbed, the more the world seemed to open up around them, revealing vistas that stretched to the horizon in every direction. Ben, despite his exhaustion, found wonder in every stream and meadow they passed. His laughter began to return as they walked, tentative at first but growing stronger with each mile. Katie collected flowers and interesting rocks, filling her pockets with treasures that would remind her of their journey. Even Tommy, burdened as he was with the weight of new responsibilities, began to smile as they left the scene of their tragedy behind. On the second day, they crested a ridge and saw the valley spread out below them like a green carpet. A river wound through its center, fed by waterfalls that tumbled down from the surrounding peaks. The meadows were thick with wildflowers, and stands of cottonwood trees provided shade along the riverbank. "It's beautiful," Rose breathed, her hand finding Elijah's. "It's home," he replied, "if you want it to be." They made camp by the river that night, building a fire from driftwood and fallen branches. As darkness settled over the valley, they sat around the flames and began to plan their new life. There would be challenges. Winter was coming, and they would need shelter before the first snows. But for the first time in months, they were looking forward instead of back. "We'll build a new cabin on that rise," Elijah said, pointing to a gentle slope that overlooked the river. "Good drainage, protected from the wind, and we'll be able to see anyone coming from miles away." "Can we have a real kitchen?" Katie asked. "With shelves for my books and a place to dry herbs?" "We can have whatever we want," Rose said, her voice warm with possibility. "It's our valley now." As the days passed, they began to make the valley their own. Elijah taught Tommy how to build with stone and timber, how to select the best trees, and shape them into the bones of their new home. Rose and Katie worked together to establish a garden, planting seeds they'd saved from their old life and tending them with the patience of people who understood that good things took time to grow. Appointed himself the guardian of their small livestock, a few chickens and a goat they'd traded for with a passing prospector. He talked to the animals as if they were old friends, and under his care, they thrived in their new environment. But it was in the evenings, when the work was done and they sat around their fire, that the real healing began. Elijah started telling stories again, not the dark tales of war and violence that had haunted him for so long, but the old Cherokee legends his grandmother had shared with him. Stories of creation and renewal, of courage and love, of the connections that bound all living things together. "My grandmother used to say that every person carries two wolves inside them," he said one night, the firelight dancing on his face. "One wolf is fear, anger, jealousy, and hatred. The other is love, hope, compassion, and peace. The wolf that wins is the one you feed. Which wolf have you been feeding?" Katie asked, her young face serious in the FIRELIG. Elijah looked around. The circle of faces, seeing the family he'd never expected to have, the love he'd thought was lost forever. "For 10 years I fed the wrong wolf," he said quietly. But you've taught me to feed the right one." Rose reached across the fire and took his hand, her fingers warm against his scarred skin. "We all have," she said. "We've all learned to feed the right wolf." As autumn painted the valley in shades of gold and crimson, their new cabin began to take shape. It was larger than the old one, with room for the family they'd become and the dreams they were building together. The walls were thick and strong, built to last through whatever storms might come. On the day they finished the roof, they stood together in the doorway, looking out over the valley that had become their sanctuary. The river sparkled in the afternoon sun, and the meadows stretched away toward the mountains like a promise of endless possibility. "We did it," Tommy said, his voice filled with wonder. "We really did it. We did," Elijah agreed. "And now we get to live in it." As winter approached, they prepared for the challenges ahead with the confidence of people who had faced worse and survived. They had food stored, fuel for the fire, and most importantly, they had each other. The broken Cherokee warrior who had bought a family at auction was gone, replaced by a man who had learned that the greatest battles were fought not with guns and knives, but with love and hope and the courage to keep believing in tomorrow. Valley held them gently through the long winter months, its ancient peace wrapping around them like a blessing. And when spring came again, bringing new life to the meadows and streams, they knew they had found what they'd been searching for all along, not just a place to live, but a place to belong. 5 years had passed since the night their world burned down, and the valley had transformed them as much as they had transformed it. The cabin they'd built was no longer just a shelter, it had become the heart of a thriving homestead, surrounded by fields of corn and wheat that swayed in the mountain breeze. The garden Rose had planted with such hope now fed not just their family, but the travelers and traders who had begun to seek them out, drawn by stories of the Cherokee man and his family who had found peace in the sacred valley. Tommy was 17 now, tall and strong, with his father's steady hands and his mother's gentle heart. He'd grown into the kind of man who could split logs all morning and spend his afternoons teaching Ben to read, patient with the boy's struggles and proud of his successes. The rifle he'd once carried in fear now hung above the mantel, a reminder of darker days that seemed like another lifetime. Katie had blossomed into a young woman of 15, her curiosity about the world around her having grown into genuine wisdom. She'd become the valley's unofficial healer, combining the Cherokee plant knowledge Elijah had taught her with the practical medicine she'd learned from trading post doctors. Her reputation had spread throughout the territory, and people came from as far as Denver, seeking her remedies for ailments that traditional medicine couldn't cure. Ben, now 11, had grown into a boy who saw wonder in everything, a trait that had saved them all in ways they were only beginning to understand. He'd inherited his father's Irish gift for storytelling and his adoptive father's Cherokee spiritual sense, weaving the two traditions together in tales that delighted visitors and kept the old ways alive for a new generation. Rose had aged gracefully, her auburn hair now touched with silver, her green eyes bright with the contentment of a woman who had found her place in the world. She'd become the unofficial mayor of their small settlement, mediating disputes and organizing the community gatherings that brought their scattered neighbors together. Her kitchen table had become a place where problems were solved and friendships were forged, but it was Elijah who had changed the most. The haunted bounty hunter who had walked into that auction 5 years ago was gone, replaced by a man who wore his Cherokee heritage like a badge of honor rather than a burden. He'd become a bridge between worlds, helping his white neighbors understand the old ways while teaching his own children to honor both sides of their blended family. On this particular autumn evening, as the aspen leaves turned gold and the first frost painted the meadows silver, 3 wagons rolled into their valley. The lead wagon carried a family that looked frighteningly familiar, a woman with hollow eyes and 3 children who clung to her skirts like frightened birds. "Ma'am," Elijah said, stepping forward as the wagon stopped in front of their cabin. "What brings you to our valley?" The woman looked up at him with eyes that held the same desperation Rose's had carried 5 years ago. I heard there was a Cherokee man here who helped people. People like us. What kind of help do you need? My husband died in the mining accident up at Silver Creek. Company says we owe them money, more than we can ever pay. They're selling us tomorrow. Her voice broke slightly. I heard you might understand. Elijah felt Rose's hand slip into his, felt the warmth of his family gathering around him. He looked at the woman and her children, seeing himself and his own family reflected in their fear and hope. What's your name? He asked gently. Sarah Mitchell. These are my children Daniel, Mary, and little Joseph. Well, Sarah Mitchell, you're welcome to stay here tonight. Tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next. As the family settled into the cabin's warmth, sharing the evening meal and the stories that bound communities together, Elijah found himself thinking about the strange turns his life had taken. The auction that had changed everything, the violence that had nearly destroyed them, the healing that had made them whole. Later, as the house settled into quiet, he sat on the porch with Rose, watching the stars wheel overhead in the clear mountain sky. Another family, she said softly. Another chance to make a difference. Another chance to feed the right wolf. He agreed. From inside the cabin came the sound of quiet conversation as Tommy and Katie shared their beds with the Mitchell children, offering comfort and friendship to souls who had forgotten what safety felt like. Ben was already planning the adventures he would show them tomorrow, the secret places in the valley where a child could find wonder and peace. Do you ever think about how it all started? Rose asked. That auction, the choices we made? Elijah was quiet for a long moment, remembering the dust of Bitter Creek, the desperate bid that had changed 5 lives forever. I think about the man I was then, he said finally. Lost, angry, running from everything that mattered. And I think about the man I am now. And I like this version better. Rose laughed, the sound carrying across the valley like music. I do too. He's a good father, a good husband, a good man. He had good teachers. As they sat together in the comfortable silence of people who knew each other's hearts, Elijah thought about the legacy they were building in this valley. Not just the crops and cattle, not just the buildings and fences, but something more important, a place where broken people could heal, where families could be forged from love rather than blood, where the old ways and the new could exist in harmony. The Cherokee had always believed that some places were sacred, set aside by the spirits for special purposes. As he looked out over the valley that had become their home, Elijah understood that this was such a place. Not sacred because it was untouched, but sacred because it had been consecrated by the lives lived within it, the love shared beneath its sky, the hope that grew in its soil like the corn in their fields. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new families to help, new bridges to build between the worlds that seemed determined to tear each other apart. But tonight, sitting on his porch with the woman he loved and the children who had taught him to love again, Elijah Ravencrow was exactly where he belonged. The broken Cherokee warrior who had bought a family at auction was gone, replaced by something infinitely more valuable, a man who had learned that the greatest legacy wasn't what you took from the world, but what you gave to it. And in the sacred valley where the old ways lived on, where children learned to feed the right wolf, that legacy would continue long after the last star faded from the sky. The gamble he'd taken 5 years ago had paid off in ways he'd never imagined. He'd risked everything on a single moment of compassion, and in return, he'd found not just a family, but a reason to believe in tomorrow. Some bets, he'd learned, were worth taking no matter what the odds. And in the end, love always won.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.